Hi, it's Sarah Elder. Welcome to the Briefing Note podcast. Today I am joined by someone who I've already shared offline that I have, um, held in a very kind of revered spot for a very long time. Andrea Reimer. I'm so excited to have this chat with you today. Thank you so much for saying yes.
Sarah, you're making me blush. But I also am a Madam Premier Sarah Elder fan.
Ah,
So excited to be here. I was in your shop in Calgary. My mom lives in Calgary and she's in her, I don't know if she'd want me to disclose it. She has seen many a political battle. She's like another generation older. I was
okay.
adopted, so she's like two generations ahead of me.
Yeah.
And she walked into your store and she was like, "Where has this been all my life?" It was
Oh,
such a moment. Yeah, she bought a sweatshirt and whenever we're on Zoom, the sweatshirt is there. And I'm like,
nice.
"Go, mom."
Well, yeah, that's how this started. I wanted to wear things that reflected my values of advancing, women in politics and Canadian politics, and that this space, yeah, it's unlike any other, and I'm so happy that other people have that moment when they come in too. So, um, there are so many things I want to talk to you about, but maybe let's start with let's start with your earrings, actually, because I was admiring them before. So tell me who they're by.
So the artist is Warren Stephen Scott,
Mhm.
and he is an Indigenous person from here on the Pacific Coast. I should mention I'm in Vancouver.
Yes.
So yeah, I've been a Warren Stephen Scott fan for a while. I know across the country different sort of earring typologies become common, but here on the coast, these happen to be wood, but like acrylic, Salish or Haida form line earrings have become very popular. And these particular ones are a special release for his birthday, where he had a friend with all this gold foil. And so he took his regular earrings and put this gold foil like kind of randomly on them. But I love it. I'm not a gold person, but it's made me think about gold in a whole different way.
Yeah, they're really beautiful. I have you seen the show North of North?
I love North of North. It is I okay, maybe this is like true confessions with Andrea Reimer. I've actually watched every episode at least twice and would probably watch it a third time in the right moment.
I think that it's so smart and so well written. You could read watch it and you would get there would be unlocked layers because I do think it's so smart and so beautifully done. But also the fashion, the indigenous fashion in that show. Oh my gosh. And the earrings, is so good. It's just,
It's amazing.
it's,
Yeah, there's some great, I'm trying to think of where, I think it's actually just North by North Speed, is that you can hear about the fashion and
oh really?
the
I haven't
different
gone that far yet.
designers. Yeah, it's worth checking them out on Instagram. When the show first came out, they were talking about the different designers and the different jewelry and beading. And yeah, I mean, one of my favorite things about the show, and as we're talking, I'm realizing it actually has broader implications. And here we are on Canadian Film Day, so it's a perfect day to
Oh,
land this.
yeah.
Um, so the show, what I love about it is there's an Indigenous woman on a screen, which is amazing all by itself. But then there she is being totally honest. Like there's no troping her. It's not like Kim's Convenience or something where it's sort of put in this box of what we expect a certain race or
Yeah.
cultural heritage to be like. She's just herself, right? And it is really incredible to see. And how amazing would our Canadian content be if that's how we started to expand how we're talking about and to each other?
Well, and I also think that, I mean, I'm going to be telling everyone I know that they need to watch North of North, and if it's on Netflix now, and you know, just people being who they are, I think is a great way for us to understand, this human project that we're all involved in living on Earth. And I think there's so much we don't know about each other. And then, when you leave space to fill in like you don't, what you don't know, you don't know. And so, you can assume or imagine or do whatever else. And then what you're putting in that space is, filled with subconscious and conscious biases and, like all of this different stuff. We need to create and hold space for people to be who they are, no matter, how perfect or imperfect that may be.
Yeah, no, that is a great summary of it. Yeah, it's the whole deal and why we have a national broadcaster, right? Like
Yes,
the, well,
100%. And the continuation of that national broadcaster must continue. And it's not the first time I'm going to say that. I actually think um, they should have more resources, not for executive compensation, but for creating more series, like North of North, which I actually think was an APTN production. Um, but for content that, um, can give Canadians the ability, when they're asked, tell me about Canada and what it means to be Canadian, you can say that it's more than beaver tails and maple syrup.
well, and I think like my reference to CBC, and it's right, it was an APTN show, but I've been a subscriber to APTN for many years. There are a lot of shows on there that you've never heard of, and the reason that are amazing. And the reason you've heard of this one is because it was on CBC and now going to Netflix,
Yeah.
right? And so I think the ability, the production, I think APTN is essential for that, for telling.
Yes.
I don't think it would be so honest if it wasn't coming from
Mm.
APTN's perspective. But then having the Canadian audience being like, wow, this is something I didn't know about in my country and that I love about my country.
Yeah, I want more Canadians to be, we need to be able to again hold space for the complexities, the all of the horrors, the atrocities, the Canadian experience, everything that encompasses, but also in the present and current day, what that means. Um, you know, I really hope that in this, crazy world of politics that right now we're in, people are embracing more of a Canadian identity because we're under like the threat of annexation from Donald Trump. But, going beyond, being proud to say I'm Canadian, but, understanding all that that means and being able to articulate it, I think is really important. And so I hope that we take we can come away from this experience with more of that. That being said, I am prepared to be disappointed because I thought coming out of COVID, for example, not that we're actually even technically out of it, but that community would be a focus and all of these kinds of other things. And then we're like, oh no, we're in a rush to get back to how things were before, and then all of the the best practices and lessons just go up in smoke.
Felt like we got left with the worst parts of the world before COVID, and all those good things just have been like a waterline that have been receding. There's still some pretty amazing pockets
Yeah.
of care that I see, and this concept of caring for each other is not abstract anymore, I don't think, but whether or not we prioritize that is really where the debate is.
Mm. So you obviously had priorities going back to enough to be able to run for school board in Vancouver and then council under on a with a party with Gregor Robertson, who now fast forward to 2025 is running as a federal liberal for Mark Carney. How do you what was it at the time when you first ran? What were the priorities that got you in the arena?
Wow, that's such a great question. And just for context, I was elected the first time in 2002, which feels like ancient history now, but and it probably is in some respects. So I first started getting involved in sort of formal party politics in 1996, which is definitely ancient history. That's almost 30 years ago.
But in BC political context, a very important, like
A
the
super
late
important election.
90s, early 2000s were an absolutely kind of like a really interesting time for BC
I
politics.
love being on this podcast, Sarah. Like normally I have like, well, here's my whiteboard and let me just explain, especially if you're not from BC where we're, it's a bit of a
It's like a whole
eh,
other world.
yeah, and
Yeah.
it's a bit of a blood sport here. And so
Yes.
we take it very seriously. I sort of chalk it up. Toronto has all those big professional sports teams. We have politics, right? So there's some of us who are very invested in the policy part of politics and others who just sort of use it as another way to like sort of support a team. So mid 90s, the NDP sort of won a bit by surprise in 91. I don't think anyone saw that coming. In a modern world with all the social media and stuff, it was almost like a Mark Carney election type phenomena, right? Where there was all this crashing around of leaders changing and stuff, and then all of a sudden out popped the NDP. And so at that time in my life, I was very involved in two distinct, I mean, I'd give them different names now, but at the time we would have called them anti-poverty work, like what we'd call probably social justice and economic security type work now. And when I say work, I'm putting that in air quotes. Like some of it was volunteer, some was
A
work.
lot
Like
of unpaid.
yeah, I made enough to get by, but also like per the anti-poverty work was like living a very low income, and that's a whole other long story. But and then also through that work had come to realize how badly our environment had been trashed by industrial activities over many years. And my family come from the working class, and so I'd seen the fishing up close. I'd seen the farming and the agriculture up close. I'd seen the forestry up close. But understanding the links back to the environmental impacts of that, and then critically, how low income people, even if we could raise education, housing, access to transportation, access to good jobs, we're still going to suffer the worst of the impacts of that environmental degradation. So had gotten involved, like that this wealth of the environment is a common wealth. And so therefore it benefits people who don't have private wealth the most by far. And so got very involved in trying to, like that era, the War of the Woods era of British Columbia, very involved in trying to protect intact wilderness areas at that time. And through that, got convinced to work with the Green Party in the 1996 campaign, which to me was like radical mainstreamism for me. Like that's how far outside the sort of standard political world I was at the time. But I realized, I think very importantly, that we could spend all this time trying to convince people who didn't agree with us to agree with us, or we could put all that time and energy into electing people who agreed with us. And so I was like, okay, we're gonna put some time and energy. We put so much time and energy. I was the assistant campaign manager in Nelson Creston, which is a riding
Oh,
in like
yeah.
Kootenays. I was living on the coast, but that was the riding where we thought the Greens actually had a shot. So we poured ourselves in there and we got just over 10%. I think we would say 11, but I think it was like 10.4 or something like that. And we were crushed. And I subsequently found out that that vote, that time, it was the highest vote the Green Party had ever gotten anywhere on the planet at the time, even though the Green Party was sitting in coalition governments in Germany, New Zealand, had people elected in Australia. And that is when I became aware that the first past the post voting system is not the only voting system out there, and that there was just this whole world of opportunity about electoral and democratic, like governance reforms, campaign finance reform, like all these, what now seem fairly obvious policies, but no one was talking about them at the time. And for those that are listening that have only ever had a political life when there was an internet, this is also like the burgeoning years of the internet. So you couldn't just go online and be like, why is this happening to us?
You weren't getting, no, there were no targeted ads. It was like phone
No.
book times.
We literally would use phone books to look up people's addresses in
Yes.
those days and not on our phones. We would lift up a
Because that
book
also
and
did not exist.
yeah, no, this was
Yes.
all very different. So anyway, that's how I got the bug. Like, and then after that, it just became so motivated by social justice, environmental justice. Alongside those two issues, it's impossible to ignore justice for Indigenous people. It's economic justice is, just another step over, and then democratic reform. So that's kind of the big basket of issues. But I think what really drove me was like, why and we were talking about this a bit before we turned the tape on, like, why do we have to bang so hard on this door to get people into government who come from the communities who are most disenfranchised? Like, it's so obvious at one level, but when you're young in your political life, that may be an age, or that may just be like, you're
When you come to it.
exactly, which for I think many people increasingly is when they're done their careers and they're like, okay, why have I never had effective representation in government, either by gender, by class, by lived experience, by cultural or racial background? And you come to realize that there are entrenched incumbent power systems, and that if you want to have a shot at getting into that, you have two options. You either have to learn a lot about that power system and figure out where you can kind of be like water and seep into it, or you can figure out how you're going to create a new door and bring people through that one, right? And I don't think they're mutually exclusive. I think if you have the energy, why not both?
Yeah. No, I agree. It's how do you because the work, the ability to change things only happens when you're at inside the door, right? Well, I, like there's yes and no, right? You can work to change those structures, but um, you know, I think that's a really, maybe this is like a whole separate podcast, but like how do you change the structures to best support how they need to be changed? Does that work happen from the inside and the outside? Like how much can you achieve from the outside? Do you need to be on the inside?
Yeah, the image that's coming to mind, these in China, there's a place, the name of which is escaping me, but the monks have these rocks, and the water um goes through the rocks and shapes them over centuries, and they sell the rocks for a great deal of money to Chinese gardens around the world. So if you go to a Chinese garden and you see all these rocks with like, really amazing holes and shapes and stuff, it's like literally the work of water over centuries that has done that. So I would say from the outside, we are the water on those rocks, right? And we can work, like, the more of us there are, the more quickly we can
Yes.
kind of break that
The
down.
collective action of that.
Yeah. But in the inside, you can actually just convince people to pick up those rocks and move them, right? Like, you don't have to go through all this trouble. But the problem is if there's just one of us inside, it's us who gets the water wears us down, right? Because the system is the water. So how do we get enough of us inside? Or, I mean, my strategy when I was on the inside was to have, I wouldn't have done it if I didn't trust and believe in the intentions of the people I was working with. Like, I definitely understood I came from a different background for sure, and probably had different motivations for the work I was doing, but we shared a desire to end homelessness, to act with courage on issues like environment and reconciliation. So, I don't need people to share my experiences to want to do the same thing, right? It did lead to some practical challenges in the way we talked about issues that sometimes created friction, but like, you got to learn how to work with other people if you want to get stuff done in politics. That said, I also had what I'd call a kitchen cabinet on the outside of it, which I set up originally just to help me remain true to the reasons I'd got in there to begin with. I mean, I think we've all observed when people get into a system that they're not normally from, that system can change them more than they change it. And so I wanted to make sure I had a kind of, I don't know, somewhere to keep my feet on the ground. And that was that kitchen cabinet. But the other thing it did, which I hadn't expected, but was, hadn't anticipated, I guess is what I would say, but was so important, was like just help me feel like I could, I'm like viscerally sighing as I'm thinking about it, like just kind of like let down my armor, I guess, and be myself with people while talking about politics.
Hmm. Well, and I mean, politics in Vancouver has I mean, having never lived in Vancouver proper, but been, born and raised in BC and worked in politics in Victoria and, been an observer of it for so long and now being on the other side of the mountains and still paying attention to it. It's like when you were elected and you had a majority, I believe, if my recollection is correct, under Gregor Robertson. And now in present day, 2025, I would describe Vancouver City Council as kind of a gong show, with the ABC party under Ken Sim being, you know, uh, frazzled. I don't know, coming apart at the seat. Like maybe that's too extreme, but they had just hoped to pick up 2 seats in 2 by-elections. They lost both. What's the how would you describe the current state of affairs for Vancouver City Council post the 2 by-election losses for ABC?
I think Gong Show is a pretty
Okay.
good summary. I mean, I might use other language that wouldn't be totally appropriate for a podcast instead of gong in there, but it's
Dumpster fire
that's
ish.
a good one. Yeah, that's a good one. I mean, I guess it's so hard to explain this without the context, which goes back quite a ways. So let me try and give like the simple highlights of it. For many years, there was a party in Vancouver called the NPA, the Nonpartisan Association, which for anyone outside of Vancouver who's just briefly learning this and being like, that's
What?
kind of nuts. Why would you call a party a nonpartisan? Anyway, so that gives you some context to it. But they were they existed in response to a communist party that came to be in Vancouver in the late 1920s and early 1930s. I'm realizing we're lapping ourselves now. There are 20s now. And so the Nonpartisan Association ruled Vancouver for many, many, many years. There was a brief moment that another kind of center-right coalition called Team broke through there. I mean, it was a difference over should, buildings be 2 or 3 stories high, basically, was the basic. There was some democratic access issues, but anyway, that was like 1970s territory. So the NPA rules were, I don't know, the better part of 60, 70 years. And finally in 2002, which was the election I first got elected in, I ran with the Greens. I was the first person elected by the Green Party to a school board anywhere in Canada, and none had been elected to council at that point. So that was kind of our big breakthrough moment. That's another podcast. But the party that won was called COPE, and that was sort of at the time the sort of progressive center left parties, I don't know, I think we'll just call them left. They had coalesced into COPE, and then also the Greens, we had a sort of non-compete agreement with them, and that allowed us to get through. The previous election, we hadn't had a non-compete agreement, and the NPA won like all but 2 seats of like 17 seats cast. We vote citywide, so you don't
Yes.
vote
There's
for
no by like region or neighborhood area.
exactly. So we vote for, oh, sorry, not 17. There's 27 things you vote for between school, park, and city on the ballot. So there's a lot of people that the NPA got through. So in 2002, this happens, but then immediately COPE breaks into 2 factions, the left, and the center left. And the center left goes on to become Vision. And there's a big mess in 2005 in that election that led to the shit show, gong show, dumpster fire kind of outcome. It was a 6-5 council, and it was like, on any given day, maybe one of the 6 would go with the 5, and who knew what was going to happen. But then the group of us who were like, we let that happen. We let ourselves split and fracture to make that outcome. So the Greens and most of COPE and Vision sort of got together into one voting bloc. So that was 2008. And that was the beginning of the Gregor Robertson era. So we had 10 years. There were good 10 years. Many good progressive policies got done. I would argue when I look, and I've done a lot of work, provincially, nationally, internationally on local government, progressive local government policy. it's hard to find a place in the world that was producing the volume or the level of progressive policy that Vancouver was at that time. And consider Stephen Harper was prime minister for almost that entirety of that
And
10
Gordon
years.
Campbell was premier.
Or Christy Clark,
Or
right?
Christy
Who,
Clark.
yeah. And weirdly in that frame, Gordon Campbell was actually slightly better because at least he supported action on some aspects of climate
Climate
change.
change.
Yeah. So
Well, yes, yes.
it was a lot. It was really a lot to deal with. So, but starting in about 2014, and I now teach and study about power for a living in addition to supporting organizations to build power. Um, if you hold power for a long time, people want in, right? We've been talking about that. And so, the Greens started deciding they wanted the power. And this group called One City, which was kind of folks who were disaffected with vision because we weren't effectively dealing with what turned out to be a global housing crisis in the context of a Stephen Harper and Christy Clark governments, we like splinters started coming off. And so essentially, the left remains very splintered in Vancouver. It managed to get itself a little bit more together in this by-election, and we saw the results of that. But it could have been really perilous. They managed to get it down to three parties instead of six, which is what we had in the last full election was six progressive parties, and they just, canceled each other out. But this time they ran three people for two seats, and it could have gone really badly, right? But there was a group of us who felt like, I think I was probably one of the first out of the gate to be like, we can't leave this to chance. Like somebody needs to come out and say, here's who I'm voting for, right? And maybe that will inspire others too, and we can get some consensus here. And then the right, for their part, the NPA blew up. Oh, I don't know. I don't track their blow ups as closely, but I'd say like 3, 4 years ago, they finally
Yeah.
sort of disintegrated.
Like really before and during, like before the last municipal election in Vancouver, I would say, right?
Yeah, they
Um,
had the single largest bloc on council, but not a majority. They were one vote short of that, but they couldn't use their bloc effectively to pull other people to them. They spent a lot of time arguing over which of them had the most power rather than think about, well, I'm okay with that because I think worse outcomes would have happened in Vancouver if they would have figured out how to use their power. But
hmm.
instead, they blew up into three separate parties. The NPA kind of remained a team. We saw one of the daughters of the people who was fairly prominent in team back in the day, Colleen Hardwick. She shows up. And then we have Ken Sam, who's moved from the NPA over to ABC. And so they managed to out fundraise and out organize everyone else and pick up a majority in the last election, but they have been splintering as well. They've kicked out a counselor and they're not able to compel. I think part of the challenge is they never had a vision. Their vision was they weren't a shit show. That like the last council before them was very much sort of characterized by kind of like, oh, there's a ride in carnivals called like the Wild Mouse or something where you're like jerking around all the time on this kind of rickety roller coaster. That's kind of what the last council felt like. And now we have a party that ran based on its ability to get things done and work together, not be able to get things done and not be able to work together. But I think even worse than that, and the main issue in the election that just ran, they just don't seem to care about Vancouverites. Like they don't evidence, they may or they may not, but they don't show that they have any understanding of the challenges we go through. And then even if they might understand it at a intellectual level, they don't seem to feel it the way we're all feeling the challenges in our lives.
Well, remind me again off the top of my head, I can't remember. When is the next municipal election?
Next fall. So we'll
Next fall,
be
right?
October 2026.
Yeah. So that could be, I mean, that could produce a very different outcome in terms of what Vancouver City Council looks like, depending on how things proceed from here. And I think so much of what's happening is playing out behind the scenes. Like the public isn't even really aware um, of it, based on my observations largely from Twitter. But it's really interesting. And to your point, BC politics are so wild, right? Because you could have a Gregor Robertson majority council in Vancouver, Stephen Harper as a prime minister, Gordon Campbell slash Christy Clark as a premier. How people vote in BC is very different, I think, than anywhere else in the country. It's just so interesting. And the
We
labels and the coalitions and, how parties are explained. And I'm working with this person to keep this person out. And that might change, depending on the election. It's so interesting.
Some years ago, when I was deputy mayor in Vancouver, I was standing in for Gregor at it was like a invite-only dinner that the Globe or not the Globe and Mail, can't believe I said that. The National Post, the Post Media Group was hosting. They were traveling across the country to get a sense of what different markets needed. And I felt like this was worth my time because if they're talking about British Columbia, I want them to be able to say things that are relevant and invest in the stories. Because as you point out, we're not obvious on the outside if you don't get a texture. So there we are at this dinner. There's maybe 20 of us. Rich Coleman, a former cabinet minister with what was then called the BC Liberals and is now called the BC Conservatives, which I think sums up the political ideology that he might have brought to the table. Glenn Clark, a former NDP premier, is there. Captains of industry, and then there's me, and there's this guy who's now a cabinet minister in the Tory government in Ontario, who at the time, Rod Phillips, who was the head of Post Media, and he's visiting from Toronto, and he's got a sort of chief of staff there with him from Toronto. And we all sit down, and it was almost like a bell was rung. And within seconds, Glenn Clark and Rich Coleman are at each other's throats, not literally,
Yeah.
but as close as you can get verbally to that. And I was sitting next to Rod, and the look on his face was just, it clearly is not something he was used to seeing in a Toronto environment. And I know he's in multi-partisan environments, and I'm like, oh yeah, this is him looking at the Wild West for the first time up close and personal. And it is like, we don't think much of it. It's how we have political debates and discourse here. But I realized in that moment, maybe it's different in other parts of the country. Maybe it's a little less energetic, I guess.
Well, I mean, for a solid chunk, I left BC uh, in late in 2012 and came to Alberta. And, I guess what for BC, I, saw relative political, the waves were relatively calm. As increasingly here in Alberta, things became way more spicy and tumultuous. And and then BC picked it up again, and for a while, and then uh but I that dynamic between NDP and BC Liberal, or now BC Conservative, I think even the dynamic between NDP and BC Liberal, as fierce as it was at times, the new dynamic of BC Conservative and NDP seems to be just like on a whole other level.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And, just almost like a punchline to this whole story, the BC Conservatives who came together weeks before,
Yes.
so the BC Liberals rebranded to BC United, probably not
Disaster.
total disaster, like epic political story about
What
when
not to
things go
do,
wrong. Yeah,
what not to
exactly.
do.
Yeah, so that all dissolves, and again, a group of people. It's not my group of people, so I'm not intimately familiar with it, but just out of political curiosity, I've asked around to folks I know in that world. Not dissimilar to what happened in the civic election. Like people are like, rather than like drive this car over a cliff, maybe we
Mm.
should figure out what we can do here. And so they create the space for some unity discussions, BC Conservatives. But I mean, we're not even 6 months past the election. They have already blown up into two separate parties. The Conservatives, three breakaway folks. It's over an issue of residential school denialism. So I at least appreciate it's on a point of principle that the BC Conservative leader has removed a person from their caucus, and then two others followed her. But yeah, it's very BC. I don't think this happens in the rest of the country very often, but it's kind of where we're at. But the other thing, like to contextualize it all, my theory, Andrea Reimer's theory here, is that in the rest of the country, there are institutions that predated the post-war period. Like there was enough time to build, like if you look at Montreal, I was there in September and sort of like, wow, like that building's been there longer than like probably the 10 oldest buildings in Vancouver collectively have been in Vancouver. Like it's a really different thing when you have institutions anchoring a society. I think it's got positives, like there's some stability, but the negatives of that are that it's the power. So you, like we were talking earlier about how do you get into incumbent power structures? Those are deeply entrenched in places like Toronto or Ottawa, Montreal, Atlantic Canada, like very entrenched power structures. Here on the coast, not just the coast, all of BC, anything on the west side of the Rockies, we get to make stuff up. Like we just get like it's why it's not an accident in my mind that Vancouver is the city that just pumps out innovative policy when it's working well, because we live in an environment where we constantly have new people coming in. We have the highest diversity of First Nations in the country. So we have all these indigenous cultures that we have made just like very clear choices, notwithstanding the woman I was speaking of earlier in the BC legislature. But most of us have made a very clear choice to respect and go through the hard work of trying to figure out what respect looks like in a legally pluralistic context would look like how do two governments exist in the same space? And yeah, so here we are trying to make stuff happen, right? So the downside is that leads to a lot of lumping and splitting of political parties as we sort of try to build institutions.
Well, and as we speak, within, I think it was last week, there's a new a provincial political party
Yeah.
led by,
Right. Karen Kirkpatrick.
yes,
I was like, did I forget a BC conservative splinter? But these are non-elected people who want a
yes.
centrist party.
Yeah, they want because Kevin Falcon has who knows where he is. Someone obviously does. His family knows where he is. But yeah, I think people are trying to be like, hey, Kevin, give up, control of this. But the reason why he's not doing that is because they see the fracturing of any kind of center right vote as as a way to see NDP governments elected, right? So along comes Karen, who used to be an MLA, and is now starting her own political party. And yet, yeah, it's all the rebirth of BC political structures. It's spring again.
It continues. The process, the
The rebirth,
cycle is
right?
unbroken.
Yes.
Well, and to put this all into context, because I'm realizing I was looking at federal vote numbers across the country today, just in case you asked me about them and I
Okay.
could contextualize them.
Skill testing questions.
Very on top of the BC numbers. The rest of the country, I'm like, what is going on there? It was actually super interesting. I'm glad I had a reason to look sort of province by province. I know the federal and I know BC and I know Vancouver, but from there I need to look it up. And I was looking at it and realizing what your listeners may not know if they're from outside BC is that the NDP is also a coalition party here. It's not the same NDP you see
Yes.
outside of British Columbia. So there are people in the NDP elected to government who, in I think any other province, would definitely be liberals, like no question about
Well,
it.
and the same here as Alberta, to be
Right,
honest,
because
right?
you have the same, you just have no space for a liberal, like it's squeezed out of the political
They
spectrum.
exist. The Liberal Party of Alberta does exist, but they exist in a purgatory that is entirely self-inflicted.
Right. Maybe a bit like the Liberal Party of Ontario right now, but that's
Yeah.
probably a
That's yet
whole
another
other
podcast.
podcast. Yeah, I was looking at our numbers today. And so, like, here in BC, we are, I forget the exact numbers, but it's like 39% conservative, 40% liberal, and 15% NDP. And that is how it always is, right? We are used to this extremely, our legislature, that's almost exactly what, if you change the word liberal and put NDP in and conservative, that's exactly what our legislature looks like right now. It's completely on a nice edge. So the real question is, where do those like NDP voters go? And when the center party moves to the left to accommodate those NDP voters, because the Liberals and NDP always have the majority here, like no question about it. But if the Liberals move to the left to accommodate them, their center starts to break to the conservatives,
Yes.
right? And so that is the age-old problem of BC politics. I think these 338 projections are playing havoc here because they think they're trying to extrapolate from that using a lens that clearly is not a British Columbia one. Because I can guarantee you those Liberal and NDP numbers are in the core urban areas,
Hmm.
and those conservative numbers are by and large outside of core urban areas. So it might look bitterly divided like household to household, but it's really geography to geography.
Yeah. Well, and also because it's not like just northern BC, as someone who grew up in the Fraser Valley, like that break starts Surrey to Langley, right? And Richmond is, a battleground, it has such interesting dynamics. I forgot to say when you were talking about, the largest indigenous population, we also BC is home to, the first and second, I believe, the two first cities in Canada to be non-white majorities.
That's a good
Richmond,
point.
right?
Yeah.
And I think Surrey is close. Well, so even I'm not sure, maybe I don't know about Surrey, but Surrey is also close to overtaking the size of Vancouver, I believe, in terms of population. So it's just such a fascinating. BC politics are just absolutely amazing. I love it.
Yeah, no, it's super interesting. And you can see how it's hard. Well, I mean, there's a bunch of things that are hard for us here about engaging in federal politics. I saw Kim Campbell speak. It was when Harper was running, so I'm going to guess it was 2011. Does that sound like a year we had a federal election? Yeah, that was a year we had a federal election. And so she's talking and she's like, everyone in Ottawa thinks we're really like spacey on the West Coast. And she's like, we're just jet lagged. And I was
Ah,
like, yes, that is exactly the problem. The first time I went to Atlantic Canada, I was like, now I see why we never, like, we have so much in common from a list of grievances perspective to Central Canada, but we'll never work together because they wake up at 6 their time and it's like 2 in the morning here when that's happening. And we're not up till 9 our time, right? And by then they're having dinner. And like, it's a big country. It's
maybe
very
that's
hard to
why
get together.
nothing happens on changing the time. It's all contrived to keep
It's
us.
to keep us separated.
Well, also, it's so fascinating about East Coast politics because I don't believe I had ever met anyone from Newfoundland before I actually moved to Alberta to Fort McMurray. And there's such a huge presence of Newfoundlanders in Alberta, but specifically in Fort McMurray for, economic reasons. Um, but I had never, and, chalk it up to not knowing enough about Canadian history. Thanks, education system. But I had never heard of Joey Smallwood before, who, and there are a large number of people in Newfoundland who are still really have like lingering anger towards even Newfoundland being a Canadian province, and it's like it's just so fascinating, so
Yeah,
fascinating.
no, it's a very big country. But why is it so cool that you're doing this podcast? I feel like it's such a great way to bring people together around these different political realities.
Well, I mean, and to be honest, like the conversation that you and I are having, I'm like, it's just kind of it's been a lot of history. It's like it's a it stands alone in kind of the conversation that we've had, and I've really enjoyed chatting with you.
I've really enjoyed this too. I wasn't expecting it to go to history, but I'm realizing like I have a good friend who's a historian, by training and works a lot on drug policy. And it's true, like if you don't understand the historical roots of the forest you're kind of walking through, it's pretty hard to figure out your way out of it.
Well, and I mean, yeah, BC politics is just, you can't, I mean, yes, you could. The communications person, and I know I could find a way to more succinctly, do it, but I don't think it does it justice because um it is so nuanced and the history really informs, the present day and by the time you go to the polls next fall, the landscape could be completely different.
Oh yeah, yeah. When we were talking about the next civic election, so I like the big punchline on all of this, which I don't know. I'd be so interested to hear if it made it over the Rockies. We stood in line for hours to
Yes,
vote,
I saw
and
that.
yeah, it was just it's
And we're not talking
something.
like a line like to wait for brunch, not a brunch type line. We're
Yep.
talking, um, imagine someone said, I'm giving out stacks of $1,000 bills and people got in line.
Yeah, no, it
That
was.
was that the lines were crazy.
Yeah, and that was a confluence of two things, and I think a good place maybe to end.
Yeah.
One was a terrible government that made massive cuts to people's access to democracy. So the problem wasn't that more people showed up, it was that there was far less infrastructure there for them. I mean, okay, it did double in turnout from the last by-election, but we're still only talking 18% of voters showed up. So it wasn't like a crushing level of voter turnout. What it was a crushing disdain from a government for the idea that people might want to show up and vote in a by-election. The second thing that happened, though, and the reason people stayed in those lines, and you could see it, you could see who was staying in line, what they were wearing, like what
They
kind
were
of in
committed.
they were very committed, and the wealthier folks in line, by and large, left. And so that tells you the level of commitment to change in Vancouver is very high right now. How that's going to play out over the next year, because wanting an effective opposition is different than thinking that opposition is going to be good for government. So I
Mm,
think that's our work over the next year.
that is a great place to leave it. Yeah. Well, I hope this isn't the last time that we chat, to be honest.
I can be your Vancouver correspondent if
Yeah.
you,
Well,
yeah.
here I would love for there to be more podcasts, right? And like if you ever wanted to start a podcast, I would help you do that.
Well, it's funny. It's so ironic you mentioned that. I have a podcast I do for
Oh,
some folks called She, They, Us. I'll send you a link. It's
yeah.
about the specific way that the housing crisis is impacting
Oh,
households led by women and gender diverse folks.
okay.
And I literally have to run because I have someone waiting for me because we're recording. We just got funding for our second season, so we're
Oh,
recording it right
congratulations.
now. Yeah, so I'll send you a link for the
Yeah, send me
first
the link and
season.
then I can share it out with people because I know that there are people who would be listening to this who would want to listen to that.
Amazing. Okay,
Yeah.
cool. That's awesome. Thank you,
Okay.
Sarah.
Thanks, Andrea.
Have a great day.
You too.
Okay, bye.
Bye.